Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. In the aftermath of the Second World War is where we are. It was a global conflict that had redrawn the maps, it had shattered empires, and an uneasy silence settled over the world that had been profoundly changed. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not only signaled the end of one devastating war, but had also unveiled a terrifying new form of power, casting a long shadow over the nascent peace. The Grand Alliance, forged in the crucible of war against fascism, soon began to fray. As our textbook aptly notes, quote, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, erstwhile allies, soured soon after the Second World War, end quote. This episode, talking about the shadow of the Cold War and the post-World War II era, is going to explore how and why this happened and how this new global struggle would reshape America and the world. So let's go. The rapid dissolution of the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was not entirely unforeseen. Of course, beneath the surface of their shared enemies, the Nazi Germans and the Imperial Japanese, lay deep-seated ideological incompatibilities between communism and capitalism, and their divergent national interests were temporarily covered over by the necessities of war. The American system, rooted in democratic capitalism, was in stark contrast to the Soviet Union's Marxist-Leninist ideology and its state-controlled communist system. Historical precedents, such as Western intervention in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, had already sown the seeds of distrust and mistrust. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, meant to chart the course of the post-war world, instead exposed these growing rifts as the war was still going on. Disagreements over the future of Eastern Europe were particularly acute. Stalin was seeking a buffer zone, a friendly set of states between the Soviet Union's western border and those within Western Europe, to prevent them from trying to invade Russia once more. The Soviets and the Soviet Union lost more people in this war than any other country. It's an understandable fear. The Western powers, particularly the United States and the Great Britain, advocated for self-determination and democratic elections in these liberated nations, a principle that clashed directly with Soviet security aims. The fate of Germany, too, became a major point of contention, with differing visions for its political and economic future. Into this climate of rising tension stepped figures who would articulate the terms of the emerging conflict. In February of 1946, George F. Kennan, the U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Moscow, dispatched what was called the Long Telegram to the State Department. This document became foundational to American Cold War policy for the next few decades. Kennan argued that the Soviet hostility was inherent and driven by traditional Russian insecurity as well as Marxist ideology. He wrote famously, quote, "World communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue," end quote. He said, quote, "There could be no cooperation between the United States and the Soviets," end quote. Kennan's analysis suggests that Soviet policy was not merely a reaction to Western actions, but, quote, arises mainly from basic inner Russian necessities and the perceived outside world as evil, hostile, and menacing, end quote. The Long Telegram provided a compelling intellectual framework for a policy of containment, a strategy to contain and prevent the spread of Soviet influence outside of traditional Soviet borders. The language employed by Kennan, stark and almost biological in its condemnation of the Soviets, was not merely descriptive. It actively constructed this narrative of an irreconcilable conflict. There was no middle ground, thereby narrowing the perceived scope of any sort of diplomatic engagement with the Soviet Union. Just a few weeks later, in March of 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill came to the United States, to Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman by his side, and he delivered a landmark address. He declared that, quote, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, end quote. This powerful metaphor vividly dramatized the division in Europe into Western and Soviet spheres, an iron curtain between them. And it captured the public imagination, solidifying this perception of a bipolar global world. Like the long telegram, Churchill's speech helped to frame the emerging superpowers in a rivalry in confrontational terms, making compromise appear increasingly difficult, if not impossible. So the Cold War, as our textbook defines it, was, quote, a global political and ideological struggle between capitalist and communist countries, particularly between the two surviving superpowers. Cold because it never got hot, direct shooting war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The generations-long, multifaceted rivalry nevertheless bent the world to its whims, end quote. The United States championed democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union promoted communism and a centrally planned economy. The stage was not merely for a political or military contest, but for what many perceived as a battle for the future of global civilization itself. The crucial question became, what would this policy of containment entail in practical terms? Into the intellectual void came a framework of containment that soon translated into concrete American foreign policy. In March of 1947, President Harry S. Truman addressed a joint session of Congress responding to Britain's inability to continue providing aid to Greece and Turkey, nations then perceived as threatened by communist insurgencies. They had both had a lot of riots and other sort of uprisings, and the fear was that they would soon turn communist. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, Truman declared, quote, I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, end quote. Truman framed the global situation as a choice between, as he said, quote, two ways of life, end quote. The one way was founded on majority will, on free institutions and individual liberty. The other on minority will, on terror, oppression, and the suppressions of freedoms. This doctrine marked a pivotal shift, committing the United States to a global policy of intervention against any perceived communist threats, a significant departure from its traditional peacetime foreign policy of non-intervention and isolationism. Complementing this political containment was an ambitious economic initiative. And we'll talk more about that in the affluent society, our next topic. Post-war Europe now lay devastated. Its economies were shattered, creating fertile ground for social unrest, as they had seen in Greece and Turkey, and therefore, in American eyes, if there is global unrest, then that's fertile ground for communist expansion. In June of 1947, the Secretary of State, George Marshall, proposed a European recovery program, widely known as the Marshall Plan. Marshall stated, quote, our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, despair, and chaos, end quote. The plan aimed to revive European economies, establish a market for American goods, foster stable democratic governments favorable to capitalism, and thereby contain the spread of communism. Over the next 4 years, Congress appropriated more and more money, more than $13 billion for European recovery. The Soviet Union, however, viewed the Marshall Plan as an instrument of American economic imperialism, designed to create an anti-Soviet bloc to make European countries dependent on the U.S. Moscow rejected the aid overall and prevented its Eastern European satellite states from participating or receiving any Marshall Plan money. As historian Adam Ulam observed, quote, with the Marshall Plan, the Cold War assumes the character of position warfare, solidifying the economic and political divisions on the continent. The sense of threat escalated with the Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb in 1949, and the victory of communist forces in China that same year. In this tense atmosphere, the United States National Security Council produced a top secret report in 1950, the infamous NSC 68. This document painted a very dire picture of the future, asserting that the Soviet Union, now with an atomic bomb capability, was driven by, quote, a new fanatic faith, antithetical to our own, end quote. Its goal and ultimate goal was imposing, quote, its absolute authority over the rest of the world, end quote. NCS 68 declared, quote, the issues that face us are momentous, involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic, but of civilization itself, end quote. It described the Soviet Union as a slave state whose, quote, implacable purpose is to eliminate the challenge of freedom, and that they had polarized the world. The report called for a massive buildup of American military strength in a more assertive global posture, advocating that the U.S., quote, make the attempt to bring order and justice by means consistent with the principles of freedom and democracy, and to frustrate the Kremlin design and hasten the decay of the Soviet system, end quote, through means just short of total war. NCS 68 provided another ideological and strategic justification for the dramatic expansion of spending on defense to make a more militarized approach to containment along with the Marshall Plan's economic that would shape U.S. policy now for decades. These political and economic strategies were soon added by military alliances. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a collective defensive pact stipulating that attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This was a cornerstone of Western military containment. The Soviet Union responded in 1955, following West Germany's admission to NATO. We'll get to that in a moment. And they created the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance of the USSR and its Eastern European satellites. These opposing alliances formalized the military division of Europe, institutionalizing the arms race and creating two heavily armed, ideologically opposed blocs on either side of the Iron Curtain. The American policy of containment, while often framed in defensive terms, incorporated elements that were perceived by the Soviet Union as inherently aggressive. For instance, NSC's 68's call to actively work towards the decay of the Soviet system, as they said, went beyond mere prevention of expansion. It went to disable the country. Each American action, from the Truman Doctrine to the Marshall Plan, even to the formation of NATO, was interpreted in Moscow as part of a broader strategy of encircling the Soviet Union, as well as upping in hostility. This prompted Soviet countermeasures, such as the establishment of the Warsaw Pact, which then served to confirm American fears of Soviets wanting to expand, creating a dangerous feedback escalation mistrust loop and continued military expansion. Furthermore, by framing the conflict in such stark moral and existential terms, free people versus attempted subjugation, civilization versus slave state, American policymakers limited their own diplomatic flexibility. It was our way or the highway. Compromise, then, could be painted as appeasement or weakness in the face of a foe that would not move. This is what we would call a Manichaean worldview. While effective for mobilizing support domestically, it complicated the diplomacy necessary on the world stage to manage a superpower rivalry without resorting to direct, catastrophic conflict, and often obscured a deeper understanding of Soviet motivations beyond simple ideological fanaticism. The Soviet Union had goals beyond simply being just crazy for communism. As we've seen in our previous episodes, history builds on itself. The Cold War did not erupt in a vacuum. It was shaped by the legacies of United States history, particularly if we go back to the beginning of where we started, the unfinished business of Reconstruction and the transformative impact of the years that followed, the industrialization, the labor movement, Gilded Age, Progressive Era, and so forth. As we've explored in the previous episodes, Reconstruction's aim at building and rebuilding the South, integrating 4 million newly freed African Americans into the fabric of American society, ultimately failed. And it failed to secure lasting civil and political rights. It led to the entrenchment of Jim Crow system, as well as racial segregation and disenfranchisement in the South. This deeply embedded racial inequality became a significant vulnerability for the United States on the Cold War's global stage. The United States projected itself as the champion of freedom and democracy abroad, and the Soviet Union effectively looked at the situation and used the reality of American racism as potent propaganda. The Soviet media relentlessly highlighted instances of discrimination and lynching, the denial of basic civil rights of African Americans, thereby seeking to undermine America's moral authority and appeal, especially among the newly decolonizing nations in Asia and Africa, many of which had non-white majority populations. As one analysis points out, quote, U.S. vulnerability to moral critiques were readily appropriated into Soviet propaganda. Soviet propaganda campaigns were designed to disrupt the image of the United States government as a global paragon of freedom and equality, end quote. The unresolved issues of Reconstruction thus directly impacted America's ability to wage the Cold War effectively on moral terms, creating an imperative for federal action on civil rights, a theme we'll return to in the next episode. Similarly, the legacy of America's rise as an industrial superpower during the Gilded and Progressive eras and the concurrent struggles of the labor movement also resonated in the Cold War period. The nation's immense industrial capacity, as showcased in winning World War II, was undeniably a cornerstone of its Cold War strength, fueling this now new arms race and enabling massive aid programs like the Marshall Plan. It also underpinned its military might. However, the historical anxieties surrounding labor unions as potential sources of radicalism, i.e., they're communist, and this was evident in the earlier Red Scares, resurfaced with renewed intensity in the Cold War period. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, for example, placed significant restrictions on union activities and, crucially, required union leaders to sign affidavits affirming that they were not members of the Communist Party. This legislation contributed to the purging of communists and other leftists from labor movements and fostered the development of what has been termed, quote, Cold War liberalism. And this was what happened in major unions. This often meant aligning union leadership more closely with government Cold War objectives, sometimes at the cost of more militant or radical labor activism and internal dissent. The drive for national unity against perceived communist threat reshaped the American labor landscape, curtailing a lot of its autonomy and integrating it more firmly into the anti-Soviet consensus. While termed a Cold War, the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union frequently erupted into hot armed conflicts, but these were fought by proxy. The first military confrontation, the first major one at least, occurred on the Korean Peninsula. Following World War II, Korea, which had been a Japanese colony and had been known as Manchuria, was divided at the 38th parallel, with a Soviet-backed communist regime forming in the north under Kim Il-sung, and a U.S.-supported, nominally democratic government in the south led by Syngman Rhee. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea, aiming to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. The United States, under President Truman, quickly committed its forces to defend South Korea. The United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet Union boycotting its sessions at the time, passed resolutions condemning the aggression and authorizing the formation of a united UN command led by the United States. This marked, as described by the UN command itself, quote, the world's first attempt at collective security under the United Nations system, end quote. The war unfolded in several distinct phases. Initially, North Korea forces pushed deep into the south, cornering UN and South Korean troops in the small area around the port of Pusan. The tide turned dramatically in September of 1950 with General Douglas MacArthur's daring amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. This brilliant maneuver, quote, cut the North Korean forces in two, and it allowed the UN forces to recapture Seoul and advance rapidly northward, approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. This advance of the United Nations and backed by the United States, triggered a new dangerous phase of the war. In October and November of 1950, fearing American aggression near its own borders and aiming to support its communist ally, the People's Republic of China, which borders North Korea, intervened massively, sending hundreds of thousands of, quote, People's Volunteer Army troops across the Yalu River. This intervention significantly altered the balance of power, leading to brutal fighting in the harsh winter conditions, including the infamous Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, where U.S. Marines and soldiers faced overwhelming odds. This war also precipitated a major crisis in American civil-military relations. General MacArthur publicly disagreed with President Truman's strategy of a limited war, advocating for an expansion of the conflict to send the United States into China, including the bombing of Chinese cities and potentially using atomic weapons on China. Truman feared a wider war, and the use of such weapons would draw the Soviet Union into another global nuclear conflict. And so Truman relieved MacArthur of his command in April of 1951 for insubordination, a decision that, while controversial, firmly upheld the principle of civilian control over the military. With MacArthur no longer at the helm, the war settled into a bloody stalemate, roughly along the 38th parallel where it started, and it was characterized by trench warfare and heavy casualties. After 2 years of protracted negotiations, an arms disagreement was finally signed on July 27, 1953, establishing a ceasefire and creating the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, a heavily fortified buffer zone, and continues to this day to divide North and South Korea. Crucially, quote, a permanent peace treaty has never been signed, end quote. The Korean War resulted in millions of deaths, including soldiers and civilians, and left the peninsula devastated. And if you've ever seen the show MASH, that's what war is taking place. It was a brutal demonstration of the Cold War's capacity for lethality, and it solidified the divisions in Korea, intensifying global tensions and underscoring the ever-present danger of superpower confrontation. The conflict and its stalemate also drove the United States to increase its U.S. military spending going forward, using the ideologically shaped NSC-68 as its backbone. Beyond Korea, the Cold War played out across a rapidly changing global landscape, marked by an era of decolonization or former colonies becoming independent. Between 1945 and 1960, dozens of new states in Asia and Africa gained independence from European colonial rulers. These newly independent nations, often impoverished and strategically located in or around rich natural resources, became new arenas for this conflict between superpowers economically. The United States found itself in a complex position. Its founding ideals resonated with this aspiration for self-determination. Yet, its Cold War anxieties about communist expansion and its commitment to its NATO allies, who often sought to retain their colonial possessions like the British or the French, they wanted them for economic and military strength, and this frequently led to contradictory policies. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, actively courted these new nations, portraying communism as an inherently anti-imperialist ideology, and it was thus a natural ally for a national liberation movement against empires. The U.S. employed various means, including financial aid packages, technical assistance, and sometimes covert operations and assassinations to encourage newly independent nations to align with the West and to prevent perceived socialist or communist takeovers, with notable concerns arising in different places like Indonesia, French Indochina, Egypt, and Iran. Many emergent nations, however, resisted being drawn into the superpower rivalry, forming what they called the non-aligned movement following the Bangdun Conference in 1955, choosing instead to focus on their own internal development. Decolonization thus dramatically reshaped the international order, creating this, quote, third world battleground, where the US and the USSR vied for influence and often with a profound and lasting consequences for the nations involved themselves. Independence wasn't just simply becoming independent. This competition frequently led the United States to support undemocratic but anti communist regimes, even dictators who were pro capitalist, and thereby created a tension within its own proclaimed values of promoting freedom and democracy globally. A contradiction that was not lost on observers in newly independent world or on the Soviet Union and their propaganda. On the home front, the anxiety of the Cold War did not remain something internationally and on distant battlefields. It actually permeated American society. It fostered a climate of fear and suspicion directed at perceived enemies, communists within our borders. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next episode. But for now, this period is often referred to as the Second Red Scare, and it was fueled by this potent mix of genuine concerns about Soviet spies, the shocking news that the Soviets actually developed an atomic bomb in 1949, the shocking news that China fell to communism also in 1949, as well as high-profile spy cases like those involving Algier Hiss and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused and ultimately executed for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. As our textbook describes, quote, McCarthyism was a symptom of a massive and widespread anti-communist hysteria that engulfed Cold War America, end quote. Even before Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to infamy, the Truman administration took steps to address concerns about communist infiltration. In 1947, Truman issued Executive Order 9835, establishing loyalty reviews for federal employees. While intended to root out genuine security risks and to counter Republican accusations that Truman and his administration were soft on communism, this program institutionalized a hunt for disloyalty within the government. It created an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion, leading to investigations, interrogations, and the dismissal or resignation of thousands of federal workers, often based on flimsy evidence and mere accusations. It was Senator Joseph McCarthy, though, a Republican from Wisconsin, who came to personify the most extreme excesses of this Second Red Scare. He gave a famous speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in February 1950, and McCarthy claimed to possess a list of known communists working in the U.S. State Department. He actually pulled out a list. It was a list from his wife. It was his grocery list. But in it, he said, quote, today we are engaged in a full all-out battle between communist atheism and Christianity, end quote. Regarding the infiltration, he asserted, quote, I have in my hand 57 cases of individuals who would appear to be either card-carrying members or certainly loyal to the Communist Party, and who nevertheless are still helping to shape our foreign policy, end quote. McCarthy's tactics were characterized by sensational and, more often than not, unsubstantiated accusations, and the hearings were televised in the House of Un-American Activities, where he bullied witnesses and relentlessly campaigned to expose these subversive communists in the government and other institutions across the country. He, quote, fueled fears that communism was rampant and growing, end quote. And the impact was devastating for many. As one of our sources notes, quote, those accused by McCarthy faced loss of employment, damaged careers, and in many cases broken lives, and contributed to a widespread climate of fear. However, McCarthy's crusade did not go unchallenged. In June of 1950, Senator Margaret Chase Smith, a fellow Republican from Maine, delivered a courageous speech, her declaration of conscience to the Senate on the Senate floor. She powerfully rebuked McCarthy and his methods, stating, quote, I don't want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the four horsemen of fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear, end quote. She lamented that, quote, the American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents. Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America, end quote. Smith's declaration, supported by 6 other Republican senators, was a significantly, though initially outnumbered voice of reason against the prevailing hysteria, highlighting the profound damage being inflicted upon American principles for free speech, due process, and the presumption of innocence. The House of Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, also was a central player in this Red Scare, and they conducted extensive interviews into the alleged communist influence in various aspects of American life beyond the government, and most famously, in Hollywood. The Hollywood 10, a group of screenwriters and directors, were cited for contempt of Congress and jailed for refusing to testify about their political affiliations or to name others who might be communists. This led to the creation of the infamous Hollywood blacklist, which barred hundreds of actors, writers, directors, and other entertainment professionals from employment due to their alleged communist ties or sympathies. The personal toll was immense. Playwright Lillian Hellman, when called before the HUAC, refused to name names of her associates, famously writing a letter to the committee, quote, to hurt innocent people who I knew many years ago in order to save myself is, to me, inhumane and indecent and dishonorable. I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions, end quote. Her refusal led to her blacklisting. Dalton Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10, later reflected on this period as, quote, a time of evil. There were only victims, end quote. Ring Lardner Jr., another of the 10, in his defiant testimony before HUAC, responded to the question of his Communist Party membership with the memorable line, quote, I could answer it, but if I did, I would hate myself in the morning, end quote. The UCLA's Library Centers for Oral History Research holds so many valuable interviews with individuals like Alfred Lewis Leavitt, Helen Stoll Leavitt, and Paul Jarrico. So go check them out, because their recollections of this devastating impact of blacklisting on their careers is real. Parallel to this Red Scare, and often intertwined with it, was the Lavender Scare. It was a systemic persecution of gay men and lesbians in the federal government. Homosexual individuals were deemed to be security risks because they believed that they were vulnerable to blackmail by Soviet agents, and thus they were unfit for government service. David K. Johnson, who wrote a book, The Lavender Scare, documents this purge, noting that, quote, in popular discourse, communists and homosexuals were often conflated. Both groups were perceived as hidden subcultures. Both groups were considered immoral and godless. Many people believed that the two groups were working together to undermine the government, end quote. Thousands of federal employees were fired or forced to resign due to their sexual orientation. President Eisenhower issued an executive order, 10450 in 1953, explicitly adding, quote, sexual perversion, end quote, as grounds for dismissal from the government, effectively barring gay men and lesbians from all federal government jobs and extending scrutiny to government consultants. Personal tragedies from this abounded. Senator McCarthy himself cited Case 14 and Case 62 as homosexuals who were security risks. Franklin Kennedy, an astronomer fired from the Army Map Service in 1957 after an arrest for consensual homosexual conduct, fought his dismissal all the way to the Supreme Court and later became a pioneering gay rights activist. The persecution extended to women, though defining a lesbian relationship for the purposes of official action proved actually to be quite challenging for authorities. The Red Scare and the Lavender Scares were not merely existing exercises in identifying actual spies or security threats. They became powerful instruments for political opportunism and enforced an ideological conformity, a conformity we're going to talk about next episode, as well as suppressing a wide range of social and political extent that extended far beyond communism. The broad and often vague definitions of what it meant to be subversion, disloyalty, or a security risk allowed for the targeting of individuals with left leaning liberal political views, as well as civil rights advocates who challenged the racial status quo. Another conflation was civil rights and communism, but also the LGBTQ plus individuals who transgress prevailing social norms in a time of conformity. The lack of due process and the public nature of the accusations, the witch hunts that created such a potent chilling effect on free speech and expression, radiated across American society. This witch hunt for enemies often damaged the very democratic principles the United States claimed to be defending on the global stage, and it mirrored the external Cold War's worldview, creating another problem. It created an internal other that needed to be identified and purged, similar to how the Soviets on the world stage needed to be as well. The defining terror of the Cold War was the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The United States' monopoly on the atomic bomb ended abruptly in August of 1949 when the Soviets successfully detonated its own atomic device. This event triggered a desperate and escalating nuclear arms race. Both superpowers poured vast resources into developing even more powerful weapons. In 1952, the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear device that was orders of magnitudes way more destructive than the atomic bombs they had used in Japan. The Soviets followed suit with their own H-bomb testing thereafter, with sources indicating 1953 or 1955. It's hard to tell which one, but it wasn't long after. This massive stockpiling of nuclear warheads was the result. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union had achieved roughly nuclear parity with the United States, both sides possessing thousands of weapons capable of destroying the planet many times over. Out of this terrifying reality emerged the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This theory posited that a nuclear attack by one superpower would inevitably trigger a devastating retaliatory strike from the other, resulting in the complete annihilation of both attacker and defender and the world. While MAD created fear, it also paradoxically was believed to act as the deterrent against any sort of first strike. Nuclear deterrence theory, which holds that the threat of a massive retaliation prevents one from attacking, became the central tenet of Cold War strategic thinking. Political scientist Kenneth Waltz outlined key requirements for successful nuclear deterrence, including a survivable second strike capability, reliable command and control systems, and the avoidance of false alarms. The debate continues among historians and strategists as to whether deterrence truly worked during the Cold War or if other factors, such as caution or luck, actually is what prevented a nuclear holocaust from actually happening. Life under the shadow of the mushroom cloud profoundly affected American society at home. Civil defense programs aimed to prepare the populace for a nuclear attack, though how well any of these measures might have worked was often dubious, and I'll give you an example. School children across the nation participated in duck and cover drills, illustrated by films like the animated Duck and Cover featuring Bert the Turtle, on how to supposedly protect themselves in the event of a nuclear blast. Go check this out on YouTube for Duck and Cover. Great song. Historian Alex Wallerstein has noted that these drills were often mocked. While ducking and covering under a desk might offer some minimal protection from the effects of a distant nuclear detonation, like flying debris or thermal radiation, but more significantly, these drills, quote, channeled a growing panic over an escalating arms race, end quote. It gave people something that they could do so they wouldn't have to fear it. And along with the promotion of backyard fallout shelters, fostered a pervasive anxiety about nuclear war. In a curious attempt to formalize nuclear technology, some companies even marketed, quote, atomic energy lab toy sets equipped with radioactive materials, supposedly to help Americans become more comfortable with nuclear energy. Amidst the escalating arms race, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former five-star general, winner of World War II, offered both proposals for cooperation and stark warnings. In his 1953 Atoms for Peace speech before the United Nations, Eisenhower advocated for the peaceful application of nuclear energy and proposed the creation of an international agency to promote such uses. However, it was his farewell address in January of 1961 that delivered one of the most enduring admonitions of the Cold War era. Eisenhower warned against escalating Cold War into a military industrial complex. He stated, quote, the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes, end quote. He also cautioned the public policy could become, quote, the captive of a scientific technological elite, end quote. This was a remarkable warning from an outgoing president with deep military experience about the dangers of a permanent armaments industry, a military industrial complex, and its pervasive influence on government and policy, how it can shape society, and even the direction of scientific research within the company, potentially making peace anywhere harder to achieve and distorting national priorities. The Cold War also fueled intense competition in other technological arenas, most notably the space race. This contest was deeply rooted in the nuclear arms race, as rocket technology was becoming essential for delivering nuclear warheads to the other side of the world. And thus the space race became, quote, an extension of this ideological battle for global prestige. The Soviet Union delivered a profound shock to the United States in 1957 with the launch of the satellite, Sputnik 1. This was the world's first artificial satellite. This achievement changed the world overnight, and I can't stress that enough. And it demonstrated Soviet technological prowess and fears of their superiority over the United States. The U.S. scrambled to respond, launching its first satellite, Explorer 1, in January of 1958 and establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, later in that year. The Soviets achieved a series of early milestones in the space race. Laika became the first animal to orbit around Sputnik 2 in 1957. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space aboard Vostok 1 in April of 1961. And Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space aboard Vostok 6 in 1963. The U.S. countered with Alan Shepard becoming the first American in space in May 1961, and John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth in February 1962. In May of 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy boldly committed the United States to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth by the end of that decade. He didn't live to see the end of the decade, spoiler alert, but his goal was achieved. But we'll get to that. This goal, however, galvanized what would become the Apollo program, which early setbacks, including the tragic Apollo 1 fire, achieved a stunning success when Apollo 8 orbited the moon in December of 1968. The ultimate triumph came in July of 1969 when Apollo 11, with astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, walked on the lunar surface, a monumental achievement for the United States in a decisive victory in the space race against the Soviet Union. Beyond space exploration, the intense military and technological competition of the Cold War spurred numerous other advancements with lasting impacts to this day. Jet propulsion technology, crucial for both military aircraft and for the missile delivery systems, advanced rapidly. Materials science saw breakthroughs in developing lightweight, heat-resistant materials for spacecraft and for high-performance aircraft. Innovations now found numerous civilian applications. The demands for complex calculations for missile trajectories for code breaking and space missions drove significant progress in creating computers and microelectronics. The need for smaller, faster, and more reliable components led to the miniaturization that laid the groundwork for modern personal computers, for the smartphones in your hands, and other digital technologies. Indeed, Soviet Marshal Nikolai Ograkov reportedly acknowledged in 1983 that the West had won the Cold War largely because, quote, modern military power is based upon technology, and technology is based upon computers. We will never be able to catch up to you until we have an economic revolution, end quote. One of the most transformative technological developments was ARPANET, or Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, established by the U.S. Department of Defense in the late 1960s. Designed as a decentralized communication network to withstand potential attacks by linking universities and defense contractors, ARPANET was the precursor to the Internet. The first message was sent in 1969. A transatlantic link was established in 1973, connecting all of the NATO allies. Even medical technology benefited in this time period, with advancements in sensors and imaging tools for space missions contributing to the development of MRI and CAT scan technologies we use today. The immense fear of nuclear war thus paradoxically fueled an era of unprecedented innovation, laying the groundwork for future global interconnectedness, even as the primary drivers were national security. Civil defense measures like duck and cover, while offering a little, if no, practical protection against a direct nuclear strike, served a crucial psychological and political purpose: to manage public anxiety and create a semblance of preparedness, thereby helping maintain public support for the enormous costs and the inherent risks of Cold War policies. One of the most profound paradoxes of the Cold War era was the United States' position as the global champion of freedom. It was championing its freedom and democracy while simultaneously enforcing racial segregation and discrimination against its own peoples at home. This glaring contradiction, the unresolved legacy of slavery, the failure of Reconstruction, became a significant Achilles heel for America in its ideological struggle against the Soviet Union. While our textbook notes that some anti communists also became opponents of Jim Crow, the broader atmosphere of the Red Scare could also be used to stifle activism by labeling it as subversive. Any calls to end Jim Crow could only be actuated because of communist influence, not the desires of black people themselves. In the early 1950s, the U.S. State Department estimated that nearly half of all Soviet propaganda focused on the United States' racial discrimination. This constant barrage damaged America's international prestige and its credibility as the world's moral leader. This international pressure, however, created a compelling geopolitical incentive for the United States federal government to begin addressing domestic racial injustice. American officials increasingly recognized that segregation was not just a domestic issue, but it was now a foreign policy liability that hampered their efforts to win allies and counter Soviet influence in what would be called the Third World. This dynamic played a significant role in several landmark moments of the civil rights movement, like the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, which declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Historians like Mary Dudziak have argued pervasively that the Cold War context was a crucial factor in the court's decision and cannot be underplayed. The Brown case was thus seen not only as a victory for racial justice, but internationally it was seen as, quote, a blow to communism because the case would enable peoples of color around the world to believe that democracy was a just system of government, end quote. The crisis surrounding the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 further underscored this connection. when Governor Orville Faubus used the Arkansas National Guard to prevent 9 African American students, the Little Rock Nine, from entering the previously all white school, the events captured intense international media attention. Images of angry white mobs screaming obscenities and threats as calm, dignified black teenagers were broadcast around the globe. It provided a powerful indictment of American racial society. Quote, the Soviet Union claimed a moral victory over the United States, end quote, with Soviet newspapers running headlines like, quote, troops advance against children. The damage to American international standing because of incidents like this was immense. U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles publicly stated that the Little Rock crisis was, quote, not helpful to the influence of the United States abroad, end quote. Ultimately, President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and dispatched troops from the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division to enforce the court-ordered integration of Central High, a decision driven in significant part by the need to repair America's image on the world stage. African American activists and organizations skillfully used this Cold War context, highlighting the hypocrisy of American foreign policy to press for democratic reforms at home. However, the pervasive anti-communist climate also presented its own challenges. To maintain legitimacy and avoid being smeared as red or subversive, many mainstream civil rights organizations felt compelled to distance themselves from the more radical elements of their movement and to purge individuals suspected of communist sympathies, a process that sometimes led to internal divisions in the civil rights movement. Figures like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, who were critical of U.S. foreign policy and expressed admiration for aspects of the Soviet Union's stated commitment to racial equality, faced severe government harassment and public condemnation. Thus, the Cold War's impact on the civil rights movement was deeply paradoxical. It provided both the crucial leverage and language for achieving landmark desegregation reforms by framing them as national security imperatives, while simultaneously enabling more suppression of radical black activism and activists through a potent weapon of red baiting. The struggles for the civil rights became inextricably linked with the global battle for hearts and minds, and we'll discuss more of that in our next episode. The Cold War, a decades-long twilight struggle, as President Kennedy once termed it, profoundly reshaped not only global politics, but also the very fabric of American life. It forged enduring alliances, but also forged animosities that continue to influence international relations to this day. It led to unprecedented levels of military spending and technological innovations, from the terrifying power of nuclear weapons to the transformative potential of space exploration and the internet. Domestically, the Cold War fostered an atmosphere of anxiety and conformity, marked by the Red and Lavender Scares, which curtailed civil liberties and ruined countless lives in the name of national security and anti-communism. Yet paradoxically, the global ideological competition also provided a crucial impetus for the advancement of civil rights, as the United States grappled with the hypocrisy of championing freedom abroad while denying it to many of its own citizens. The Cold War, as our textbook concludes, quote, forever altered American life and the generations of Americans that lived within its shadow, end quote. As we sit back and reflect on this era, several questions linger. How do the geopolitical fault lines established during the Cold War continue to shape our world today? In what ways does the national security framework, so powerfully solidified during those decades, still influence U.S. policy and ongoing debates about the balance between security and liberty? And how has the vast technological legacy of the Cold War, from nuclear arsenals to digital networks, continued to evolve, presenting us with new and complex challenges and opportunities? The Cold War may be officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but its shadow is long. Understanding its multifaceted origins, its global and domestic impacts, and its complex legacies is essential for navigating the complex world that we inhabit today, but also to understand how we got there. And we'll start that way next episode. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.